We all know that William Steinitz is the godfather of modern chess strategy, but did you also know that he was a vicious and brilliant attacking player as well? In fact, after going over this game, I'm going to ask the question. You can put it in the comments section how you feel about it. Was he as good or even better an attacking player than Paul Morphy? Of course, he was a world champion, so we're talking about very elite chess. So this game was played in 1862 at the Grand Tournament in London. His opponent is a player by the name of Augustus Mongredian. Steinitz has white, Mongredian has black. Let us jump right in. Steinitz begins with e4, and black plays d5, the center counter. Pawn takes, queen takes, knight to c3, and queen to d8. Now, this would have been seen as a bad move throughout much of chess history, but even recently has had something of a resurgence. It seems strange to play queen takes pawn and then just move the queen back to d8, but the idea is that at some point black will often play c6 and the queen will end up on c7, and it doesn't really matter if the queen goes to a5 and then to c7 or to d6 and to c7. Basically what black wants to do here is create a Caro-Kann-like pawn structure without having to deal with all of that Caro-Kann theory. That's sort of the idea behind this quick queen to d8. White plays d4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, and Steinitz plays bishop to d3, and he has three minor pieces developed, and we can see this bishop is aimed at the king side if black's king were to end up there. Bishop to e7, castles, castles, and bishop to e3. Steinitz has gotten all of his minor pieces developed and is ready to formulate a plan. Black plays the move b6. You notice that this bishop at c8 is blocked by the pawn on e6, so the idea of this move is to activate the bishop at b7 and place it on the long diagonal. Knight to e5 from Steinitz, and this is played against a very natural move from black. That's the move knight b to d7. If black were to play that now, Steinitz would play knight to c6, hitting the queen and the bishop. When the queen moves, and he would take the bishop, and basically he would have space in the bishop pair and would be comfortably better. So because of that, bishop to b7 is played instead of developing the knight. But now f4, a very aggressive move from Steinitz. The idea, of course, it supports the knight a bit, but it also threatens to play f5, opening up a half-open file for this rook at f1, getting that piece activated and into the game. Now knight b to d7 from black, queen to e2 from Steinitz, and here black does not want to take that knight on e5, because after fe5, white is gaining a tempo against the knight, and all of his pieces are aiming at black's king, and this would be very difficult for black to deal with that attack. So instead, he plays knight to d5. It looks like black wants to exchange some pieces. Obviously, he could take off the dark squared bishop, which would be a good exchange for him. Steinitz goes ahead and takes that knight, but here black takes with the pawn. Now, he would have been better off taking with the bishop for two reasons. One, it keeps this diagonal open and keeps this f3 square under control, but also it leaves this pawn at e6 to help control f5 a little bit. I mean, white can still play f5, but he has a little bit more control over it with that pawn at e6. But black takes with the pawn, and that allows Steinitz's next move to be played, and that's the powerful idea of rook to f3. This rook lift made possible by the fact that the bishop at b7 is now blocked by the pawn at d5, and this rook wants to go to g3 or h3 and attack the king at g8. So here black plays an interesting move. He plays the move f5 to block this bishop at d3, because in this position Steinitz has a very serious threat. He's threatening the classic Greek gift sacrifice of bishop to h7 check. After king takes, rook h3 check, the king would have to go back to g8 because the knight controls g6. Then just queen to h5, and black would be completely lost. The threat of mate would force black to give up both his bishop first, but then his queen. That would be the only way to stop mate, so that would be losing. So because of that, f5 is played. The problem with that move, of course, is it makes this knight on e5 quite strong. It's now on a square. It cannot be kicked away by a pawn. Perhaps black is hoping that he himself can maybe play knight f6, e4, and get his own knight on a strong square. We'll see if Steinitz gives him time for that. Rook to h3 from Steinitz, threatening an immediate queen to h5, which would be extremely hard for Black to deal with. Black would like to play knight to f6, continuing that plan of moving to f5. The problem with that is that it hangs the pawn at f5. So that's why he doesn't do that here. Instead, he plays g6. So the g6 pawn keeps the queen out of h5, but it's another weakness, another lever for White to generate attacking play against Black's king, which he immediately does with the very aggressive g4. Steinitz is not playing games. He wants to open up this position at Black's king, trade off on f5, or if Black trades, he can take with the queen. Black does take on g4, and in this position, queen takes g4 is perfectly fine for White, but Steinitz plays an even more aggressive move. Rook takes h7, the sacrifice of an entire rook. Without immediate, he doesn't get his material back. I mean, this is a straight-up sacrifice for the attack. So king takes h7 was played, or excuse me, it was not played. Knight takes e5 was played, but what happens if he goes ahead and takes the rook here? Then bishop takes g6 check. The bishop supported by the knight. King g7, now queen to g4, setting up discoveries along the g file. If knight to f6 to hit the queen can go to g2. Then rook to g8, trying to, if the king moves, maybe creating a pin on the g file. But just f5 would make this bishop obviously very strong. And if the king tried to escape via f8, then bishop to h6 check, and Black is in huge trouble. Rook to g7 would be forced to take. After bishop to h5 check, Black would be lost in this position. So instead of taking the rook immediately, Mongradian takes the knight at e5. Pawn takes, king h7, and queen to g4. So Steinitz is threatening mate in 2. He's threatening to just take on g6, and when the king goes to h8, play queen to h7, mate. So rook to g8 is played to defend that pawn. Now Steinitz takes advantage of the pin on that pawn. The bishop on d3 is pinning the pawn by playing queen to h5 check, forcing the king to move to g7. Now here it would be a mistake for Steinitz to actually take on g6, because then Black could play king to h8, and now the rook would pin the queen to the king, and Black would actually win. Interestingly, king to f8, White still would win, because of bishop to h6 check, and he would quickly find himself mated. So only king to h8 would work, but it would work. So because of that, Steinitz does not take the pawn at g6, but instead plays queen to h6 check, forcing the king to the f file, so his rook can enter the action with tempo. King to f7, queen to h7 check, and he does not want to play rook to g7 to block that check, because then bishop takes g6 check. The rook can't take the bishop because it's pinned. And if king to f8, queen to h8, rook to g8, bishop to h6 is checkmate. And if instead he goes to e6, then queen to h3 is checkmate. So he does not play rook to g7, but instead plays king to e6, trying to run away. Maybe if he's lucky, he can escape. Maybe at c6. Queen to h3 check is played to keep the king from running away, forcing the king back into the theater of the action. King to f7, and now rook to f1 check. Now Steinitz sacrificed the rook on h7. He's still down that rook. He has not regained that material. But look at his pieces. Look at the quality of his pieces. The two bishops, the rook, the queen, while Black's pieces on the queen side are just sitting idly by, watching the action. All of Steinitz's pieces are involved in the play. King to g7 would lose immediately to queen to h6 mate, so he basically has to go to e8. He could block with his bishop, but he would just lose material. Now queen to e6 from Steinitz, hitting the rook at g8, creating a pin against the bishop at e7, and also supporting a bishop takes a g6 check move. Rook to g7 is played, but now bishop to g5, taking advantage of the pin of the bishop at e7 and sort of piling on that pinned piece. Queen to d7 makes a lot of sense, and it looks like Black might be close to escaping the attack. Not only does he offer the exchange of queens, but the king can slip away to d8, or so it appears. But then Steinitz plays this move. Bishop takes g6 check. Now the king cannot immediately run away at a d8 because of this move. Rook to f8 check. The bishop at e7 cannot take that rook because it's pinned by the bishop at g5. So queen to e8 would be forced, and then rook takes queen would be mate. So instead, rook takes g6 is played. He gives up an exchange, but he's already up a rook, but it doesn't matter. Queen takes with check, forcing king to d8, and the same motif that we just saw. Steinitz plays rook to f8 check, which cannot be captured, forcing queen to e8. Queen takes queen, check, mate. A beautiful, beautiful attack from the legendary William Steinitz, really in the style of Morphy. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.